Okay, guys, let's talk about natural selection. Now, natural selection is, let's get a nice pretty color, is the process by which organisms with variations most suited to their environment survive and reproduce. Okay, now just little things, because natural selection isn't really a hard topic to understand, but when we talk about variation, remember, variation, these are just going to be different phenotypes that you find within a population. Remember, phenotypes are just what organisms look like. They're their physical traits. If you think about humans, and you look around a classroom, your hair isn't the same as everybody else's. Everybody has different shades and different textures of hair. That's variation within a population. Or if you look at rabbits outside, well, not all the rabbits are identical to each other. You can have some rabbits that are a lighter shade and some that are a darker shade, and some rabbits are a little bigger and some rabbits are a little smaller. That's variation. And we need our populations to have variations, because if they do, and my environment acts upon those different variations, then some are going to have the phenotype or those physical characteristics that allow them to survive. And if you can survive long enough, then you get to reproduce, which is really what we want our organisms to do. Because if I reproduce, then I'm able to pass on those successful variations for that environment, which will then in turn allow the next generation to survive. But I have to have variation within a population, because if one variation or one phenotype is successful for a while, that doesn't mean your environment will always select for it, because we know environments change. And if your environment's changing, then you want to have a lot of different variations within a population, so some will survive. Now, when we talk about natural selection has three things happening. First, you have to struggle for existence. And what we mean by that is, when you have an organism, normally they have more offspring than the environment can support. Like if you think about a rabbit. So here's Mama Rabbit. Sure. There's a cottontail. There you go. There's my Mama Rabbit. And maybe she has 5 baby bunnies. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so you have these 5 baby bunnies, but maybe one of these dies because of disease, and maybe one of these bunnies dies because a predator like a coyote got it, and maybe one of these died from having some type of deformity, or maybe he couldn't run fast or jump fast or something. That just leaves 2 baby bunnies left out of 5. And so if I have more offspring than the environment can support, then if some of these die, then I still have some to pass on those traits. And hopefully these are the bunnies that have the traits that are best suited for the environment in the first place. So natural selection has to have a struggle for existence. There has to be competition. And then for natural selection to occur, I still have to have variation. That's a huge thing for natural selection, is I have to have variety within my population. And I have to be able to have the ability to have adaptation. And we'll talk about adaptation in a second. And so for natural selection to occur, I will also need survival of my fittest. And we'll talk about what fittest means in a couple different terms. So first one, adaptation. These are heritable characteristics that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. Again, these are huge ideas behind natural selection. Is I have to have traits, a heritable characteristic, a trait that allows me to survive. And it's not just enough to survive, because if all the population in the world, if we all just survived but we never reproduced, then the human population is doomed. I mean, we won't have a human species anymore. But if I can survive and reproduce, that means I'm able to pass on these characteristics to the next generation of offspring, which hopefully will survive and reproduce and keep passing them on over and over and over again. we can't forget that all individuals have variations, right? All of them have variations. Say if we have a clonal population, they probably don't stick around for very long, because if the environment changes, if they can't change with it, then you're not going to have that population anymore. Now, fitness, okay? Fitness, by definition, is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce, okay? Ability to survive and reproduce. And so when we talk about an organism being fit, I always go kind of back to this example. If you have this dude right here, and look at his big old muscles. This guy is just ripped. He even has some quads, and he's super happy. And then you have this guy next to him, just kind of this squeaky little man, right? If we were to ask you, like, out of person A, the big muscly guy, or this little pipsqueak of a man, B, who is probably more fit? And your first response would be like, well, A is, because look, he has muscles and he's just big and strong. But fitness doesn't have to be about physical muscles and toughness, right? Like, what if you have these two people and there's a monster and you have to hide in this tiny little cave? Well, the person A, this guy's a goner because he's too big to fit in this cave. But B would be perfect. And so B is actually more fit for this environment than person A. And that's because they're able to survive. And if you can survive long enough, then you get to reproduce. And that's what fitness is. So survive and reproduce is the big idea. If the environment changes, then some traits will no longer be favorable, right? And so, again, if maybe this little guy up here, he was fit for this environment, but then if the environment changes and that cave is no longer there, but you have to be able to outrun, like maybe a sand monster. Like, here's my sand monster. If you have to be able to outrun the sand monster, then maybe he's not so good. Maybe A was more fit. But because we had that variation within a population, that's going to allow somebody to survive and then reproduce and pass on those genes. Now, to get these variations within a population, usually this is going to start with mutations. Because remember, mutations, that's going to change my DNA. And if I change my DNA, then I'll change the proteins that's coding for it. And if I change my protein, that could change my physical expression, my phenotype. And so this is how I get new sources of alleles. And then once I get new sources of alleles, then I can go through sexual reproduction. And if I go through sexual reproduction, then I can pass on hopefully some of those good traits that allows the next generation to survive. Now, evidence of evolution. When we talk about evolution, we're not talking about macroevolution. We're talking about microevolution. And microevolution is the change of a population over time, right? And we can map that. We can watch a population change, because whenever we think about populations evolving, we don't always have to think in a time frame for us. Say, we can think of a time frame for maybe, let's just use bunnies, right? Bunnies can reproduce and have several generations within a year. And so that's several generations of passing on these traits. And if I can pass on these traits, then maybe some of those traits were well suited for your environment. But we have to talk about evidence of evolution. The first one being an embryological chart. If you look up embryology and evidence for evolution, you'll see a nice picture that shows a bunch of different organisms at an embryo stage. And really what it's talking about is, if you look at these pictures, the more closely related the organisms tend to look similar for a longer time. And that's just a nod towards common ancestry. That, hey, if I look the same as somebody else, then we must have a lot in common. That means somewhere down the line, we had a common ancestor between us. Now, the next evidence of evolution is a homologous structure. So we know what homo means same. So these are organs or skeletal structures that are similar. And again, this is going to common ancestry. If you were to look up homologous structures, usually you would see like a human arm, like that. There you go, a human arm. And you would look at a dog leg. There you go. And you would look at maybe like a whale flipper. Well, even though those are from different organisms, they actually have the same skeletal structure. They all have a humerus. They all have a radius. They all have an ulna. They all have carpals, and they also have all phalanges, which just is suggesting that, hey, somewhere a long time ago we must have shared a common ancestor because our skeletal structure is the same. We also have vestigial structures. A vestigial structure is a structure that's lost its function in humans. That would be like the appendix, right? Or your molars. Okay, so those are structures that used to have a job and no longer do. If you were to think about a whale still has a pelvis, which doesn't make sense because if you think about what our pelvis does, it serves as an attachment for legs. Well, you know what a whale doesn't have are legs. Or a snake, say if you look at a snake skeleton, they still have vestigial structures of legs. Well, last time I checked, snakes don't have legs, so it's a structure they used to have that they've lost. And then the last one, evidence of evolution, this is called an analogous structure. And an analogous structure, these are structures that serve the same purpose, but not structurally. And what I mean by that is if you think of a bat wing, right? There's my bat wing. You know that that has bone and muscle and skin tissue, right? Versus if you think of a butterfly wing, okay, say a butterfly wing does the same job. They both fly, but because my butterfly wing doesn't have bone and muscle and all that kind of stuff, it actually has a protein called chitin. There you go, make it pretty. There, it's like a moth. So they serve the same purpose, but this does not suggest common ancestors because they're not structurally similar. So anyway, natural selection, we're going to spend a lot more time on it, but really it's what it comes down to is I have to have variation, and with these variations, that's going to allow me to survive and hopefully reach to a reproductive age. And for me to be able to survive, that term is called fitness. Okay, hope that helps.